So first, I have to say that the attacks on public sector workers, public programs, and public universities, the language of austerity, and also the stirrings of resistance around us right now are all topics that I have not been able to pull my attention from. So I have a different focus for my talk today than what I had initially planned on, and so a new title, which is Le Langue de Coton, How Neoliberal Language Pulls the Wool Over University Restructuring, with a few notes on the limits of civility and moderation in doing anything about it. In recent years, against numerous rejections by the Faculty Senate, a public campaign by the Faculty Union, and civil disobedience by students, the administration at the University of Vermont has pursued a far-reaching restructuring of this ostensibly public institution. They've done so by increasing student numbers, tuition cost, class size, and hence the size of the university's operating budget, while shrinking the share of that budget devoted to academics. The administration has also carried out restructuring by eliminating, reallocating is the favored term, vacant faculty positions in the very department struggling to meet the needs of larger numbers of undergraduates who will amass tens of thousands of dollars in student loan debt. Why is this administration shaking more out of students while giving academics such a squeeze? To fund new research niches and other entrepreneurial ventures purportedly necessary to keep UVM competitive with other universities pursuing the same course and even the same research niches, complex systems, neuroscience. In other words, there's nothing unique about what's happening at my institution. It's another example of what Sheila Slaughter and Gary Rhodes call academic capitalism, as a public university adapts to and even embraces the neoliberal agenda of privatization, cost shifting, and austerity, while a significant share of institutional resources is transformed into a growing administration's personal wealth and directed into projects valued for their largely illusory revenue-generating trickle-down potential. As a Rutgers University budget report plainly puts it, the best practices for today's market-minded administrators include high tuition with program differentiation, large out-of-state enrollments, and a focus on programs branded as spires of excellence with greatest revenue potential. Faculty at the University of Vermont can readily recognize each of these best practices as the components of our institution's restructuring. In fact, it was in rejection of the administration's plan to launch Spires of Excellence, to be funded with another tuition hike and staffed with lines diverted primarily from the humanities, that faculty voted 3 times in the spring 2010 semester. Just as there's nothing unique about UVM's game plan for restructuring, there's also nothing particular to my campus about the language that's accompanied this transformation. Memos inviting the campus community to join the discussion of the president's vision through town hall meetings, listening tours, and working groups of campus leaders. Such ideographic words pluck at populist heartstrings while diminishing actual democracy. Any recognizable Robert's Rules sort of process is supplanted by administration-scripted events designed to conclude in vague consensus. Yet the most frequent complaint I've heard from colleagues about our present administration isn't that they're undermining faculty governance and starving undergraduate programs. Rather, it's that they're poor, very poor writers. Consider, for instance, this opening to an administrative memo titled The Road to Excellence, Advancing Academic Distinction at UVM, which prompted groans of cliched, circumlocucious, and states obvious throughout the English department. Quote, "We believe that the University of Vermont community is dedicated to the achievement of the unquestionably high yet realistic aspirations expressed in the university's vision and mission statements. Together we aim to advance UVM as a center of learning where diverse, talented faculty, students, and staff create new knowledge that reshapes understanding of ourselves and of the world around us, where social processes are energized through which the best of what is thought and known is passed on from person to person, and where members of our community are imbued with an enduring passion for learning that will not only enrich their lives, but also inspire and empower them to work to improve the quality of human life and to protect and preserve the planet that sustains us. To pursue these ends, the University of Vermont must continue to build a distinctive position among the nation's leading small research universities, recognized for overall academic quality, fortified by spires of excellence that distinguish us in undergraduate education and graduate and professional education and research, scholarship, and creative activity. That's just the memo's first 3 sentences. To be sure, this text is not headed for inclusion in the next edition of Best American Non-Required Reading. What I'd like us to consider, however, is that as an example of neoliberal rhetoric tasked to assist in privatizing and commercializing a public university, including through mimicry of a corporate mission statement, such writing isn't bad at all. Here I want to pause for a quick definition of neoliberalism, or socialism for the rich, because in the US, there's much confusion about the term, particularly in the assumption that it must be the opposite of neoconservatism. Neoliberalism is the consensus emerging out of the economic crises and recessions of the 1970s that to restore capitalism to profitability, new markets and new investment opportunities had to be aggressively sought and the cost of doing business dramatically reduced. Achieving the first, new markets and new realms for investment, has meant privatizing public resources and institutions, plus financial deregulation. Achieving the second, lowering the cost of business, has included dismantling unions, reducing wages and benefits, removing environmental regulations and trade barriers, and cutting taxes, plus the public programs and social safety nets those taxes support. Although it's strongly associated with the governments of Thatcher and Reagan, neoliberal policy has been as much a driving force of New Democrats and New Labor. Although it's associated with the rhetoric of limited government and free markets, it presumes a robust role for government on businesses' behalf, in, for instance, decreasing the rights of workers and increasing those of corporations. And finally, although neoliberalism is associated with shock doctrine tactics, as when Reagan fired the nation's 11,000 striking air traffic controllers, disaster opportunism, as with the dismantling of New Orleans teachers' unions and public schools after Hurricane Katrina, and the neoconservative doctrine of preemptive war as a means of fulfilling neoliberalism's new market goals, neoliberalism day-to-day depends on a set of fuzzy language activities that actually aim to downplay or deny the nature and extent of restructuring by avoiding controversy and anticipating consensus. In the passage that I just read from my university's administration, that passage bears all the hallmarks of neoliberalism's la langue de coton, or woolen language, including presupposition and effacement, tautological vagueness, and a tangled mix of metaphors, vision and road and spires, all bundled with excellence and distinction. Of course, launching spires of excellence can scarcely put my university on the road to academic distinction when dozens of universities are already on the very same road. Likewise, the memo's language is so generic, any institution could stand in for the University of Vermont and fit this mission. What university isn't aiming to advance itself as a center of learning? But it is precisely the generic and banal, an ironism so complete, argues linguist Jean-Jacques Le Cirque, it suffocates meaning, that woolen language aims for, ruffling no feathers, raising no hackles, by offering no substantive statements at all. Neoliberal rhetoric, writes François-René Huyghe, who first coined the term la langue de coton, has an answer to everything because it says nothing. This doesn't mean the memo's rhetoric is simply empty or without purpose beyond epideictic display. Woolen language, Le Cirque points out, aims at consensus, though it's a consensus won at the price of genuine linguistic exchange. A genuine linguistic exchange would, after all, invite public scrutiny, democratic engagement, precisely what a neoliberal agenda must avoid, as privatizing institutions and resources depends on privatizing decision-making authority. Woolen language is thus fashioned to serve, Huig argues, as a consensual language of power par excellence. In the service of university restructuring, it powers a course not towards academic distinction, but towards laissez-faire revenue generation. By packaging that course as so utterly innocuous, nothing appears amiss in an administration's pronouncement of broad agreement. We believe that the University of Vermont community is dedicated to the achievement of unquestionably high aspirations. Woolen rhetoric in the service of neoliberal goals depends then not just on the middling might of its metaphors, the soporific effects of its style. It depends also, above all, on the steady disavowal of any controversy. As decisions are moved out of participatory, public, and accountable realms, and as a public is trained to leave decision-making authority to the experts, or in the case of a university, to the administration. Take last fall, after UVM faculty had voted, 3 times voted down the proposed spires, on the grounds that the administration had bypassed faculty governance structures in creating a plan that would drain needed resources from both undergraduate education and from those research areas, environmental studies, for instance, in which UVM has distinguished itself. The administration did not respond with the direct assertion of management rights, tough cookies, there's a new regime in town. Instead, the provost responded with a 3-page letter in which she expressed gratitude for the Faculty Senate's thoughtful and substantive work and pledged continued dialogue and reflection with leadership groups in an iterative and continuing process. The letter concluded by detailing the next step in this iterative and continuing process, moving forward with the implementation phase. More, it applauded this next step as the result of our shared governance system. Here we find a further defining feature of neoliberal rhetoric, anti-performativity, where it matters little if something has been done so long as one says it has. Faculty handbook, Senate bylaws, union contract, standing in for the specific processes outlined in these documents through which the activities of shared governance are to be performed is the phrase, our shared governance system, which is then praised for having achieved the happy result of affirming and moving forward with the administration's agenda. Or think of it this way. When Margaret Thatcher was famous for declaring in the first sallies against Britain's public sector, there is no alternative. But today's cheerleaders of academic privatization dress the same message in sunny assurance. We all agree that this course we are already on is the very best one. To the amazement of faculty and the dismay of other Faculty Senate officers joining the provost in co-signing this memo, let me read that again. To the amazement of faculty and the dismay of other Faculty Senate officers joining the provost in co-signing this memo and reinforcing its "since you can't beat us, join us" theme was the Faculty Senate president himself. His eagerness to claim a seat at the Spires of Excellence table shouldn't surprise us. It's a logical consequence of decision-making that makes much of backroom consultation with governance leaders, while actual governance is jettisoned. From a rhetorical standpoint, then, what Marie-Dominique Perrault calls Woolen language's globalized nonsense, hollow words, stereotyped formulas, a veil of indifference draping and smothering genuine debate. Such nonsense is entirely purposeful. Just as a public university's restructuring depends on rebranding students as customers, restructuring depends on the relegation of faculty governance bodies to, at best, a ceremonial advisory role, a vestigial appendage of the idea of the public university serving the public good that will eventually, like public funding itself, evaporate. The memo I've just described does indeed communicate tough cookies about your Faculty Senate votes, but in a manner so stultifying that for those faculty who managed to get to the memo's end, the response was either befuddlement, wait, so the Senate approved the Spires? Or resignation, clearly this train has left the station, nothing we can do to stop it. And that, of course, is just what such a memo intends, to dispirit, disorient, even bore faculty into submission, thus completing the process of consultation and consent. Well beyond higher education, woolen language is a key opposition-muting tool in neoliberalism's project of dismantling the public sector, a project that has proceeded not only through the shock of open assault, Reagan's mass firing of the country's air traffic controllers, the current campaign to strip Midwest public sector workers and teachers of collective bargaining rights, but also the soft sell of foregone conclusion. The New York Times, for instance, greeted the new year with a page-one story on New Jersey's budget crisis that gives a textbook example of how neoliberal consensus is constructed. The story starts with an apparent question. Should the state of New Jersey cut public employee pensions and teachers' jobs or raise taxes? Then, claiming that from tony horse country towns to hard-edged cities, property taxes and unemployment are high and budgets are pools of red ink, the story neutralizes the debate. Any differences between New Jersey's tony towns and hard-edged cities are effaced. Country estate owners and the urban unemployed are presented as together shouldering the same heavy burden, while public employees go scot-free. The article thus concludes with clear consensus. Cuts must be made. There is no alternative. It is only fair. Neoliberalism's woolen language not only smothers debate, but declines to recognize that there is or could be debate. The New York Times reporter setting aside the possibility that raising taxes might have mass appeal, even though, interestingly, the same day this story ran, Wire Services reported a new poll in which 61% of respondents called for taxes on the wealthy, and the next 20% called for cuts to the Pentagon as the best way to handle budget deficits. Of course, we're talking not only about the reporting choices and omissions of single reporters and news outlets. Instead, we're confronted with a discourse with a capital D, as James Paul Gee would put it, that's been deployed to help resolve the neoliberal economic era's first major systemic crisis by scapegoating public sector workers, programs, and education. The January issue of The Economist represents the global public sector as a gluttonous woman, her belly swelling with bigger unions, better pay, fewer hours, more days off. As she eats more, a card that's marked more, she is surrounded by flames, and beside her, and this just slays me, beside her is a tiny suited businessman, and he's burning in the flames of the public sector greed. This is remarkable. And here I thought that the economic meltdown of 2008-2009 was precipitated by rapacious financial speculation in the private sector. Remarkable, too, is that despite hearing everywhere that the till is empty, public largesse is to blame, and so now is the time for us all to tighten our belts and prepare for a decade of austerity. We're also witnessing stunning resistance. Indeed, the mass revolt in Wisconsin has had such an impact that the New York Times dubbed it the Tunisia of collective bargaining rights. It managed to contest neoliberalism's foregone conclusions that the train already left the station. There really is wide agreement. Now, last night, as you may know, the Wisconsin Senate maneuvered to pass the bill that would strip the public sector unions of their collective bargaining rights. And here you're welcome to hiss if you would like. Thank you. I'm into hissing at moments like that. And so we might think then that the fight is over, the argument is lost, and indeed that's what the New York Times declared on its front page this morning. But I hope that we also consider this report from the Wisconsin State Journal out this morning. Quote, shortly after 8 p.m. Wednesday, hundreds of protesters gathered outside the locked King Street entrance to the Capitol, chanting, "Break down the door and general strike." Moments later, police ceded control of the State Street doors and allowed the crowd to surge inside, joining the thousands who had already gathered in the Capitol to protest the votes and who chanted, "We're not leaving, not this time," end quote. And that's a chant that references that earlier this week when the governor ordered an end to the occupation of the Capitol under the claim that it needed to be cleaned and that sleeping in the building was unsafe, the protesters complied and they ceded, they lost the public space over the past several days that has been needed to project their arguments. I don't know what today has held and what the future holds in Wisconsin and beyond, but as Mike Imbrogno of Ask Me Local 171 puts it, this is a turning point. People's anger is overcoming their fear. And his words and what's before us in Wisconsin and beyond reminds me of words that I also heard from an activist in Tahrir Square a few weeks back. We're patient and we're angry. Patience and anger in a democratic uprising are not antithetical. They go entirely hand in hand. Such resistance, patient anger, patient endurance, angry endurance, but this kind of resistance is also really difficult to sustain when rhetorical ideals like moderation, civility, mediation, and compromise are promoted for the purpose of delivering the same neoliberal ends that open assault cannot manage alone. In Wisconsin, for instance, teachers and public sector unions early on signaled their willingness to compromise. Don't take away our right to collective bargaining, and we'll grant you the cuts you want in our health care and pensions. The willingness to compromise can seem like an expression of our very best natures. Wisconsin's workers want to do their fair share to resolve the crisis. But if these workers sit down at the table with Wisconsin's legislature and governor, who's clearly showed that they don't want to sit down at the table anyway, what won't be on the table are the corporate tax cuts that the governor signed into law earlier this year, manufacturing the crisis in the first place. Fair share, seat at the table. Those of us invested in teaching for social justice and working for maximum democracy may be especially susceptible to the vague pieties of woolen language because they exploit ideals of mutuality and cooperation that many of us in a better world would cherish. That's the major point made by Jean-Jacques Le Cirque in his critique of neoliberalism's co-optation of Habermasian consensual communicative ideals. In a Habermasian linguistic universe, the underlying tendency of language is toward cooperation, the goal of communication, mutual understanding. Similarly, in the field of rhetoric, scholars have traced through the 20th century a growing academic preference for argument as mediation and bridge building over a contest of competing perspectives. Here we can think of I.A. Richards' 1936 definition of rhetoric as the study of misunderstandings and their remedies, or Wayne Booth's 2004 promotion of listening rhetoric, where, quote, both sides join in a trusting dispute, determined to listen to the opponent's arguments while persuading the opponent to listen in exchange, end quote. The problem here is that both Habermas's theoretical communicative situation and cooperative rhetorics imagine relative equality among participants, as well as transparency and shared interests in negotiation. As Deborah Cameron points out, when those conditions are not fulfilled, when, to go back to my university story, when an administration sits atop a power pyramid on all university matters, when an administration calls on the campus to participate in a budget-cutting exercise while withholding information about off-budget executive raises and bonuses, when an administration understands the interests of a university as entrepreneurial and profit-seeking, in these circumstances, it comes as no surprise that ideals such as cooperation and consensus favor the party with more power. Likewise, when platitudes about the virtues of civility, moderation, and compromise supplant a deep rhetorical education that grapples with how groups excluded from political participation have contested and altered civic boundaries, we and our students are ill-equipped to, as political scientist James Schmidt puts it, distinguish reasonable compromises in the name of the public good from timid acquiescence in the face of continuing political evils. Indeed, points out William Chafe in his classic history, Civilities and Civil Rights, while civility in the context of white progressivism in 1950s North Carolina included a commitment to being hospitable to new ideas, it was also defined by such an abhorrence of conflict that civility ultimately meant a way of dealing with people and problems that made good manners more important than substantial action. Here we can see, I hope, the need to restore civility's rhetorical dimensions. We need to take Edward Schill's classic definition, which is that civility is an attitude in individuals which recommends that consensus about the maintenance of the order of society should exist alongside conflict of interests and ideals. We need to place that preference for social order in relation to and in tension with social justice. This doesn't mean we give aspirations of cooperation and, yes, civility in most of our day-to-day relations the heave-ho. I appreciate all of you for not throwing things at me and booing and so forth. You're a very civil audience. Faculty, staff, and students uniting against tuition hikes and retiree health care cuts. A faculty senate moving to enfranchise all faculty in governance, not only those on the tenure track. Workers from Cairo's Tahrir Square having pizzas delivered to the Wisconsin workers occupying the Madison Capitol. Hundreds of students from Dallas's Lincoln High School walking out of class to protest mass teacher layoffs. North Carolina labor and civil rights activists moved by nationwide mobilizations for public sector workers, rallying to end the Jim Crow prohibition on union organizing in that state. These are all here and now bridge-building opportunities. But with Le Cirque, we should also consider that consensual, communicative, and rhetorical ideals are aspirations that are historically conditioned. In the United States, an unprecedented era of widening prosperity following the Second World War gave credence to the argument that labor management cooperation yielded a fair share for workers, while the apparent order brought to global finances and relations through the United Nations and Bretton Woods institutions suggested stability through discussion and compromise among world leaders taking a seat at the table. Even then, taking on the most entrenched injustices in this American dream period, we find not only leaders but movements, not only a language of mediation but a language of struggle, language that expresses a position, expresses an opposition, designates the enemy, and assembles friends and allies. More, we find language joined to embodied action, action that some foundational thinkers of contemporary rhetorical studies had at the time a hard time contextualizing as communicative and persuasive, as legitimately rhetorical. For instance, in his 1974 Modern Dogma and the Rhetoric of Assent, which builds on the work of Michael Polanyi, himself an early theorist of what would become neoliberal free market philosophy, Wayne Booth starts with an opposition between rhetoric and reason on the one side and action, particularly the action of the sit-in, equated with violence and the abandonment of reason on the other. But this is the language and the sit-in joined with the blockade, the occupation, the flying picket, the actions that were necessary in the US progressive era, the Depression decade, and the Civil Rights era to move us forward toward a world in which Habermasian communicative ideals that presuppose or aspire to equality, a linguistic communism, as Le Cirque puts it, might actually be realized. It includes the language of the muckraker, the polemicist, the sloganeer. Most recently, such language of opposition, routinely derided as la langue de bois, or wooden, has been shunned as the exclusive Tea Party trademark of right-wing racism. Even when it's employed for progressive causes, many of us have been schooled to dismiss la langue de bois as insufficiently nuanced and complex. The many recent calls for a restoration of civility to public discourse, rhetorician Rolf Norgaard has observed, wind up characterizing argument itself as a disease, with disinterested inquiry or ironic dialogue the cure. But despite so many of us being schooled in ambivalence about agonistic argument or protest rhetoric, the recent comeback of a progressive public rights language of resistance and struggle has been invigorating. In Wisconsin, when public sector workers march under the banner "Protest like an Egyptian," they're refuting the common academic claim that solidarity slogans have no efficacy in our atomized society. On my campus, it was wanted posters designed by studio art faculty and featuring faculty positions slated for elimination that shone a public spotlight on budget cuts and helped back the administration down from a mass layoff plan. Those posters did indeed promote an us versus them division and whittled the arguments down to bumper sticker size. Cutting Victorian lit, that's a cut to quality. That wanted poster, by the way, had George Eliot featured on it. The cooperation, creativity, critical discernment, and even joy that went into the creation of those posters also gave the lie to the charge that wooden rhetoric is cheerless, monotonous, and issues only from the mouths of those incapable of sustained listening and diligent inquiry. The problem we faced at UVM, a problem shared by other public universities as layoffs, position eliminations, and restructuring continues, but under obfuscating labels like resource reallocation and revenue enhancement, isn't that la langue de bois is ineffective, but that we're observing a de facto division of labor. Demonstrations and slogans are for students and maybe for a faculty or graduate student union where they exist, but only when cuts are openly on the table. Demonstrations and slogans are not for a faculty senate, even though now it is the core undergraduate curriculum and the decision-making voice of faculty about that curriculum that's under assault. Here we should recall that when Arthur Lovejoy, John Dewey, and others came together in 1915 to found the American Association of University Professors, they did so in the company, we might say with the radical sponsorship, of a host of progressive era mass movements that shared the goal of securing public rights, of arguing that there is even such a thing as public interest to be defined and defended. And earlier today there was a great talk about the IWW, the Wobblies' free speech rights in order to claim public speaking rights. We should likewise place the AAUP's 1966 statement on faculty governance against its backdrop of a campus free speech movement, a radicalizing civil rights movement, and a building tide against the Vietnam War. Any history of public institutions is incomplete without a history of immoderate struggle. Today, we're in a rhetorically topsy-turvy moment in which public programs and jobs are cut in the name of egalitarianism, in which university administrations defund undergraduate and especially liberal arts education in the name of academic excellence, and in which we're enjoined for the sake of civility to hold our tongues while actual space for civil discourse and civic decision-making contracts. In this moment, it's not only university students or public sector workers and school teachers, but university faculty, through whatever democratic, mass, participatory, organizational forms we can find or fashion, who need to take up a fuller, more contentious practice of rhetoric. If our dissent is not to be stifled in the continuing and iterative process, we may need some la langue de bois to bore through the wool. Thank you.